My name is Hugh Jass. I was just a line cook at Spiffos. Now I'm trying to survive the apocalypse. But this isn't just a story about survival. It's one of betrayal, hunger, grief, and fire. A journey through hell with a chicken at my side. All I ever wanted was to cook good food for good people. But now the undead think the only good food is me. Will I be able to find my forever kitchen in Knox County or up in the sky cafeteria? Keep watching if you want to find out. I'll never forget that first morning. I awoke in my humble trailer. I cooked myself some ground beef and sausage for lunch later, grabbed the key to my Masterson, and left for my shift at Spiffos in Rosewood. As I approached my car, though, my neighbor George started approaching me. At first, I just looked at him confused. He seemed to be shambling, as if he had been hurt. It wasn't until he got much closer that I realized there was something drastically wrong with George. I began to run, but he followed. I pushed him over and tried to call for help, but nobody came. I decided to dispatch my dear neighbor for his own sake. I would have wanted the same for myself if I were in his state. I got into my Masterson, but when I tried to start it, the fuel light came on. Empty? How could that have happened? I barely was able to exit my car. My neighbors were starting to swarm me. I got out of the trailer park on foot, but these things were everywhere. I had one focus in mind: get gas. At the gas station down the road, I was able to find some useful materials, including a gas can and a rubber hose that I could use to siphon some gas from some of the abandoned cars in the area. The outside of the building was crawling with the undead, though. I burst through the door, tripping and dropping my precious chef's hat, and I just couldn't leave without it, so I doubled back to pick it up. I walked through the town trying to find a car with some gas in it, but the horde was pressuring me everywhere I turned. I chose to retreat into the nearby prairie until things cooled down. I needed to take a rest and catch my breath on the ground anyways. I managed to loop back around unseen by the horde and found my way into a small home. At first, I had found a duffel bag, a very useful piece of equipment for my unfolding journey. But then, disaster struck. I fell out of a second-story window. I ended up with a fractured left shin. This was a dreadful turn of events. I limped my way back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed. I was going to have to wait here for a long, long while. I had always been a slow healer, after all. On the bright side, I found enough food today to hopefully sustain me for at least a few days while I waited. This was a good opportunity for me to work on my fitness, since I was a particularly jolly fellow. They called me Hugh Jass as a kid, in fact. Not sure where they got such a ridiculous nickname like that from. Unfortunately, by midnight, I was still in too much pain to sleep. I had spent the better part of the evening sitting and staring into the abyss. By 4 a.m., sitting with only my thoughts was making me exceedingly bored and miserable. What could have caused all this? I decided to alleviate my worries just momentarily with a hotties issue I had found earlier, but even images of beautiful women could not totally remedy my tedium. I went downstairs to see if I perhaps missed some useful material that I could turn into a splint for my leg, but as I walked past the front door, I alerted some lurkers and had to retreat back upstairs. I would no longer be able to leave this room now. Things began to get dire after another couple of days. My fracture was taking much longer to heal than I would have liked, and without a splint, I was going to certainly run out of food and begin to starve if I didn't do something soon. I had to take a big risk and check to see if a plank was dropped when the zombies broke the door downstairs, and unfortunately, it did not. But the coast had cleared substantially, so I chose to head out and see if I could possibly forage a tree branch that I could get away with using as a splint. Along the way, I noticed a near-deserted boarded-up home just across the street. I decided to head home and grab my hammer before going to see if I could steal a plank from one of the windows. The mission was a success, albeit quite tense. I managed to splint my leg up and limp back to the room without any issues. Then it was back to sit-ups and resting until I was fully healed. I was running low on provisions, and my leg still was taking its time to heal. I decided to raid the house across the street to see if they had any food. I was delighted to find a fridge and freezer full of food items. I got right to cooking, then after I ate a bit, I went into the house's basement to find a garden fork, a new hand scythe, and some very useful tools. Another few days were spent waiting in the bedroom. I had finally moved the TV from downstairs up, which helped stave off at least some boredom. On the 9th day in the house, I could hear the sound of a chopper hovering overhead. It startled me at first, and I considered waving it down for rescue, but knowing those things were out there lurking kept me relegated to the indoors. A few days later, I ran out of the provisions I had found earlier, and it was time for another supply run. I went to another adjacent house and was startled by a lurker in the bathroom. He broke through the window, and although I didn't want to, I had to take his life. It was his or mine. Inside the house, I found some more food, although not as much as the first provision run yielded. I checked another house and was happy to find more there, but the walk back to the bedroom was tense. I noticed a few lurkers were beginning to pepper the outskirts of the base, and at any moment, if even just two noticed me at once, I was as good as dead with this injury. I managed to skirt into the kitchen clumsily and cook a couple more pieces of food. I retreated to the bedroom, grabbing the attention of one lurker, but he lost sight of me as I escaped upstairs, thankfully. The base was getting very hot with activity at this point. By the 14th day of my recovery, I had become so regular at sit-ups that my fitness was growing noticeably stronger. That said, I was starting to run low on food again, with only a frozen pizza left over. My leg was feeling better, but I still had a clearly apparent limp that made supply runs especially risky. I was out of food, and I needed more though, so I went out to carefully check the last two homes in my immediate vicinity. The first one had almost nothing. The second one had a friend waiting for me, who I dispatched. I got a few more fixings, but this would be it. I needed this leg to heal up soon. I figured I would just keep doing sit-ups until then. Day 17 came, and I was pretty much out of food. I drank my last can of fruit beverage, and finally removed my splint to check on my wound, still fractured. I sat on the edge of that bed for a while. A long while. I could feel the weight coming off my bones from how hungry I was. Mom always said I could use a diet. I wondered where she was now, if she was fighting the horde like me, or if she had become one of them. What I wouldn't do for a hug from Mom right now. I was beginning to starve. I could feel it. I'd never been so hungry before. I needed to go out foraging. I would eat anything. Anything I could get my hands on. The good news was that my limp was getting a little better. That said, in the state I was in, if I had to fight anything, even just one lurker, I wasn't too sure how I would do. I foraged up some nettles, and I managed to get into a house further away where I found some good food stores. Unfortunately, I scraped my uninjured shin while hopping a fence and had to limp my way back to the room. This was truly becoming a survival story. I decided I would ration the food at this point, only eating when I felt that I was starving. I needed to make this last as long as possible. I didn't think another supply run would be possible. And just when things seemed so bleak, I finally felt like I could walk properly again. It was a 2-week-long side quest against all odds, but with my freshly healed leg, I could get back to looking for fuel and maybe even reach my masterson and get out of this damn place. I embarked on my journey early in the morning with all my findings in tow. I siphoned a small spit of gas from a van along the way. At my former home, I found a handful of my neighbors loitering around my trusty steed. I decommissioned them surgically, one at a time, and managed to refuel and head off. I drove past the gas station down the street longingly, knowing I would need more gas to make it anywhere meaningful, but I chose to drive past. The area was still too hot for me to justify sticking around. I expended the last of my fuel after reaching a Mad Dan's Den store up north, and had to park at a nearby home to rest for the night. I found some former occupants in the garage and took care of them quickly, but another group of lurkers began breaking down the back door when they spotted me. I scurried upstairs to sleep for a few hours, as I was exhausted by this point. At 8 p.m. I awoke in the pitch black. The county's power must have finally been cut out. Joy. I carefully exited the room, knowing the ground floor would likely be crawling with some unwelcome visitors, but after checking it out, I realized the place was empty, thankfully. I grabbed a bottle of water from my car and decided to try and use the cover of night to find some more fuel in the Mad Dan's parking lot. I hopped the fence despite there being more lurkers here than I had ever seen at one time. My bravery paid off. I was lucky enough to find another small bit of gas in one of the abandoned cars. I caught the attention of one or two lurkers, but I was back over the fence before they could do anything about it. I refueled the car, went back inside, and had another well-deserved rest. I went north with the fuel I found and came up on an area littered with the undead. I had to drive off and find cooler footing, and I turned into a scenic road. I parked the car in some trees and went looking for more fuel in the historic coalfield park just down the street. There, I found a nearly full gas tank and a locked Masterson, and I spent the day weaving between trees back and forth with my gas can until all the fuel was loaded into my humble steed. I slept for a bit in the toasty 125-degree cabin, and when I awoke, I decided to strategize where I wanted this fuel to get me. I needed food badly. I was living on maple syrup and marmalade currently, what I wouldn't have done for the homemade lunch burger blend I used to bring into my old Spiffos, and that's how I decided to head to Rosewood next. When I got to the place, it was pitch black inside. I fumbled around to get to the supply closet, then waited in there safely for some daylight to come out. When day broke and I could finally see, I poked around the old kitchen to see if some victuals were still present, but what I found in one of the drawers made me lose my appetite almost immediately. To Hugh, if you're reading this, I just want to say I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It's all my fault. We fed the people garbage to save some money, knowing it was low quality, and it spiraled into something we could never have foreseen. As I sit here, waiting in the unguarded kitchen for my impending death, I am overcome with guilt. The secret ingredient we thought would mask the low quality of our new menu was the very thing that sparked this catastrophe, and we fed it to everyone in the county, knowing it was untested and experimental. I wish I could apologize to you, Hugh. You never came into work the day the undead horde began to overtake the county. I knew that you had no idea that you were partly responsible for their rise surprising, because we didn't tell you what you were feeding the people. I know all you ever wanted to do was serve some good food to your friends and neighbors. You were always a good soul, and we took advantage of you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Hugh, if by some miracle you end up reading this, I'm sorry. Spiffo has caused all of this, and there isn't any way for us to make it right. I immediately became whelmed with emotion. I crafted a Molotov cocktail and threw it at the front of the building in a passionate attempt to burn down the now tarnished memory of it. The appropriate rainfall put out the flame, though. Every ounce of me was welling up with rage. I drove to a nearby bar I would visit after late shifts and began dispatching each and every lurker that caught wind of me without hesitation. Covered myself in their gore, and when the last one was vanquished, I began assembling every bottle of liquor that could serve as a tool for incineration. In the pitch black of the night, I waited for the sun to rise, stewing in my wrath. Around 5:30 a.m., a band of lurkers broke in, and I barely escaped the bar with my life, but I still was not deterred. I was able to craft another Molotov cocktail out of one of the bottles I had found, but after spending an entire day just trying to get into the Zippo corner store to find a lighter, and risking my life unnecessarily in the process, I finally came to my senses and realized that pointless arson would not fix any of this. I drove away from Rosewood, vowing to never return. I didn't know where I would be going next. The only thing I knew was that I had to get as far away from that place and the horde as possible. I drove to the outskirts of Mildred and slept in my car for the night. In the morning, I removed my splint from my leg finally, and it looked like it was all healed up. My car was starting to get pretty beat up from all the minor collisions I was taking on, and I needed to repair it or find a replacement badly. I drove into Mildred, and, expectedly, there was no shortage of lurkers there. I siphoned some gasoline from some of the cars here, and then decided to start dismantling small pieces of electronics anywhere I could find them. With enough effort, I could eventually figure out how to hotwire a better car. In my travel through the town, I came across a red van with a key in it. Better yet, I also found Electrical 1, a book that would help me pick up electrical skills much faster. The only trouble was that the parking lot was highly populated with the undead. I gently snuck my way back to where I parked the Masterson and brought it around with the goal of migrating its contents and fuel into the new vehicle. But the lurkers are keenly attracted to the sound of a humming engine, and they forced me out of the car when they began to swarm. I had to take a stand. I couldn't let this opportunity to increase my storage capacity slip through my fingers. I had to take drastic measures. So I started to fight, and at one point, I got back into my Masterson and decided that since I was going to ditch this loyal ride, the best thing I could do with it now was use it as a weapon to mow down my enemies. I crunched their bodies under my tires, as much as the poor thing could muster, and she was doing better than I expected for a good while, but after what felt like 50 or more kills, my rampage was abruptly disrupted. The Masterson wouldn't move anymore, and I became a sitting duck with countless undead still surrounding me. I managed to get out of the car and loop them up, and despite my heart pounding out of my chest with panic, I herded them all as calmly as I could, and led them into the woods, where I was able to barely skirt away. I took a seat and caught my breath for a little while, but I left the Masterson running when I ditched it, and every second I waited was more wasted fuel. I managed to get back to the vehicle, and the coast was nicely cleared. I moved everything to the van, siphoned some gas from a full tank I found in an adjacent locked car, and finally took off. After all that, I felt like I needed to find a quiet place to hunker down for some time. But unfortunately, as fate would have it, my next episode would be anything but quiet. I had a brief reprieve in the van a little ways away from Mildred, where I read Electrical 1. After that, I ate some food stores and went to sleep. But I awoke shortly after, tense and in a panic. The blood that I was covered in was getting to me. I needed to clean myself up. I drove by a lake and rinsed off all my clothing, equipment, and weapons, and last but not least, myself. Then, I decided to shave this raggedy old beard and the laughable hairdo I had grown over the last 4 weeks. I stood and looked out over the pond for a little while, breathing the fresh air in and reflecting on everything I'd been through in this last month. It's strange how quickly life can shrink to nothing but hunger, pain, and the sound of your own breath. Just weeks ago, I was a man in a chef's hat, worried about seasoning the beef right. Now, I was a ghost, wearing someone else's skin, wandering through ash and silence, wondering if anyone I loved still breathes. If this is survival, then maybe the dead aren't the only ones who have lost themselves. I found my way to an industrial center outside of Mildred and managed my way through some office areas, dismantling every desktop computer in sight until I got my electrical skill up to level 1. I rested for a little while in the van after that and spent some time reading Mechanics 1. It took me a couple of days to finish the book on account of my slow reading abilities, so I went through most of the food I had stored up, including the ketchup, which was quite fun to drink. I needed to make another food run, so I started the truck and went north. Misery settled in like a weight, low, constant, inevitable. And when I really got to thinking, the only thing that put a seed of happiness in my mind was the notion of just getting to cook some good food again. Living on processed snacks and non-perishables was getting to me. I came up on an abandoned food stand. Most of the food was rotted, not sure what I expected a month into the apocalypse, but I did find a couple of still edible items, including a bag of dried split peas. I had to train my skills in mechanics, but I didn't want to risk destroying my precious van in the process. I uninstalled and reinstalled the head and tail lights, then moved onward. In the dark of the night, I hit 4 rabbits in the road and decided I'd take advantage of the situation to get my hands on the first real meat I had seen in weeks. Now I just needed somewhere to cook it. I came up on a farm a little further along the road. The place had quite a few lurkers hanging around, but I was used to getting my hands dirty at this point. I found a pickaxe in the garage here, a very useful weapon. I stored my findings in the van and took a nap before continuing on my purging of the area. I fought more lurkers at once than ever before. I needed to take a break and refill my water and catch my breath before I could continue. And once I returned, I was able to finish what I'd started. My trusty garden fork had broken with one of the final kills, but it served me well to this point. I drank some chocolate milk that I found in the former tenant's fridge, then I took a well-deserved rest in a bed upstairs, which was much comfier than the driver's seat of the van. When I awoke, I equipped myself with some more weapons and began to look for some stones so I could make a campfire and finally cook this rabbit I had butchered yesterday. I placed a log in the campfire and pretended the bodies around me were just scenery. I took off my protective gear, washed myself up inside, and even removed my sunglasses, because now it was time to cook. I filled this pot of stew with the split peas I had found earlier, stuffed it to the brim with the rabbit cuttings, and seasoned it with every bit of flavor I had found in my journey to this point. I appropriately dubbed it a rabbit stew fit for a king, because in this moment, I truly did feel like celebrated royalty. After all that trouble I had been through, dispatching over 100 lurkers, I got to sit down next to a warm fire and eat what tasted like the greatest meal of my life. One bite, and I knew anything was better than ketchup from a bottle. That first gulp was ridiculous. Steam, warm fat, and a snap of something green that I hadn't had in weeks. For one ridiculous, filthy minute, I felt like the man who'd once worried about seasoning the beef. It did more than fill my stomach. It stitched something back that had been frayed. Now I just hoped that it would hold. I put out the fire, and then it was time to take this full stomach to bed. In the morning, I decided that I needed a companion. The loneliness of my journey had made me so bitter to this point. I nicked a chicken from the coop. I dubbed her Sassy at first, but then went with Mildred when I determined that she was just too innocent for insults. I went through the neighbor's house for supplies, then Mildred and I took our leave. Yesterday's cook got me reminiscing about my old life, and I decided that if I wanted to make the most of this apocalyptic hellscape, I would need to reconnect with the thing that brought me joy in the before time, cooking. Along my way to the next town, I came across an abandoned work van. After putting the stragglers around it to rest, I found a crowbar, welding mask, and a bucket in the trunk of it. I had to drop Mildred to take down the enemies here, and I took my eyes off her for just a second, which was long enough for her to get lost, unfortunately. I spent almost an hour looking for her in the woods, and began to curse myself for having already lost my only companion so soon. But thankfully, I found her. I whispered to her, "Don't scare me like that again." Then she kept me company while I worked on learning some mechanic skills in the old clunker in the road. By 5 p.m., I was getting a little bit restless with Mildred always wandering off while I was working. I would need to pick up the next rope I found to avoid having to constantly wrangle her up. I'm not sure what I expected. Chickens weren't exactly known for their long attention spans. I decided to sleep for the night and to try and forage some hemp dog bane to craft some rope with in the morning. I came across a sign that indicated a farm was in the area, and I followed the road it marked. I foraged the whole way through and found plenty of valuable things like bait for fishing and bits of wild food I could safely ingest, but no dog bane yet. When I got to the farm, I dropped Mildred off in a small enclosure so she would be safe while I took care of some of the enemies hanging around here. I went into the farmhouse and slept in one of the beds upstairs until about 3 a.m. Then I checked out the tool shed in hopes of finding a rope. Unfortunately, though, there was none. I left Mildred in the enclosure while I went foraging again. At 5:40 a.m., I did find the dog bane I was looking for. I went back to the farmhouse and crafted some rope. But then I learned that you cannot tie a rope to a chicken. Oh well, I had to make do. It wasn't her fault she had a short attention span. I patted her on the head, lifted her up, and departed from the farm. After that embarrassing ordeal, Mildred and I headed west in the van. Not too far along, I found a parking lot with 2 serviceable-looking trucks. I decided to park, drop Mildred in a nearby fenced-in area, and clear out some of the friendlies here. And for the first time since all this started, I got scratched by a lurker. I disinfected and dressed the wound, and then placed my hat and glasses back on. I hoped that this wouldn't be a death sentence. I had to be more careful. I couldn't believe I let that happen. I proceeded with dispatching the residents at this location, and when that was finished, I went into the tool shed to discover a hatchet, a tire pump, which I hadn't found yet, and some rope. I also found a generator, which could prove useful. After a day of practice, I got the hang of hot wiring. I smashed the window to the best kept truck there, moved all my materials into it, and was just able to squeeze in that generator too. I fired up the engine with Mildred on my lap, and we set course for Fallis Lake. Hugh Jass, the chef. Amateur car thief. Who would have thought? Along the way, I raided another abandoned food stand, but there was nothing of value there. At Fallis Lake, I drove along Main Street and had to bob and weave the truck between all the undead. I wanted to stop by the grocery store and see if I could pick up some cooking ingredients, but I needed to drop Mildred off somewhere safe first. I wedged her in a gas station apartment bathroom and told her I'd be right back. I slept for a little while on a bed there to recharge my energy. When I awoke in the dead of night, I retrieved a Molotov cocktail I had stored in the truck. I then began to hoard up every lurker waiting out front of the fresh market. I lost count of how many there were, maybe 200. Although I trembled with adrenaline and panic, I had grown accustomed to facing the horde in numbers like this. When the sun began to peek over the horizon, and I felt I could see enough to begin, I tossed my cocktail into the mass of bodies and lit the herd ablaze. I circled them for what felt like hours, watching them succumb to the inferno one by one, their flesh and gore reduced to ash and cinders before my very eyes. I walked calmly among them, letting the fire do all the work. I contemplated the vast canyon that had grown between the man I was only a month ago and the man I had grown to become today. When the last lurker went, ash at my shoes, I felt absurdly absolved, like I'd stared death in the face and it blinked first. Inside the rural supply next to the market, I gathered up all the shotgun shells I could fit in my duffel. I must have grabbed the attention of another small rally as they came in the back door and nearly cornered me. I drew them to the front of the fresh market and dispatched them. I needed to remain careful. There were still plenty of these things dotting the area. I took a brief rest on the ground, then went into the market to look for some cooking ingredients. I found plenty of canned goods and realized I couldn't haul it all in one go. This ambitious supply operation was far from finished still. I rested for a while in a chair in the back room, then looped back to where I left Mildred so I could check on her. When I opened the bathroom door, she darted out and ran all over the apartment. I snatched her up so her clucking wouldn't alert any of the lurkers outside, then placed her back in the bathroom, this time with the curtains closed so she wouldn't get spooked if she spotted a lurker. It didn't seem to help though. She just kept darting around the room. I pet her to try and calm her down, then went to go lie in bed for a while until it was dark enough for me to start lugging supplies over to my truck. I squeezed supplies anywhere that I could find them there, but I was running out of space quickly. I had to make one more trip back to the market to grab all the canned goods, and then I could be done with this town for good. It was a hell of a lot to carry, but I simply wasn't the type to let food go to waste. I was getting winded just briskly walking back though, and in the pitch black of night, I almost alerted an entire group of lurkers. I had to drop all the food where I stood and retreat back into a general store. Thankfully, I only caught the attention of one, but it was too risky for me to try that again. I needed to be able to see where I was walking, so I hunkered down in a supply closet until morning. I was able to collect the supplies and get to my truck, but the undead were on me as soon as I sat down in the driver's seat. I had to get out of there. I was in no condition to fight. Mildred would have to wait. Up the road, I dropped off the supplies that were encumbering me, then slept for a while to regain my strength. After some alternating restful and restless hours, I awoke at 7 a.m. in a panic, tormented by a dream about my dear comrade who I left behind. And so, I did what any good friend would do. I went right back for her. I brought a shotgun and 5 boxes of shells, preparing myself for a messy ordeal. When I reached the gas station, I started shooting, and the city answered. I had even more hunting me now than earlier, and as I blew through ammo, the realization that I was getting nowhere set in. My hands shook. Every miss pulled more teeth toward me. At this point, I wasn't going to be able to kill the problem. I was going to have to move it. I surgically herded them up and began to bring them west. I must have fired over 100 shells. I wanted every single one of them following me away from that gas station. I lured my herd to a residential area. The sheer mass of the collection had me awestruck. I was reminded of the note from earlier. I was responsible for all this, I asked myself. Every lurker in front of me, gnashing violently for my flesh, was doing so because I was too naive. The pain in my shoulder and hands snapped me out of my reminiscent days. Firing a double barrel this much in an hour would make any man's hands sore. I had never fired a gun before this, so I was in severe pain. I finally cut out and away from the herd after depleting most of the ammo I had brought with me. When I looped back to the station, I rendezvoused with my hen. I patted her little head, scooped her up in my arms, and could tell she was quite stressed. Together, we drove away from Fallis Lake. Later down the road, I found somewhere that we could use as a temporary safe house. There were a handful of stragglers around the home, and I was absolutely drained from earlier events, so I decided to pay for safety with my truck's hood and mowed them down. Once the place was cleared, I dropped Mildred off in the chicken enclosure. She fit right in with the other tenants, and there was even a coop for her to roost in at night. It was probably much comfier than the bathroom I had her locked in over the last few days. Inside, I began dragging out the bodies of the former residents of this quaint little home tucked away in the woods. After clearing out the kitchen, I breathed a hearty sigh of relief and finally had an opportunity to fall asleep. It took almost an entire day, but I cleared out all the bodies inside and piled up those strewn about outside. I also unpacked the truck and sorted all the items I had saved up neatly around the base. I was so exhausted after this, I kept my belly empty and just went to sleep. After that, I awoke to finally do some cooking. There was a large number of chickens in the coop. I would never be able to keep up with all the eggs they were laying, so I decided to pluck just one hen out. Her sacrifice would not go in vain. I made sure Mildred didn't see. I couldn't bear to let her witness that. I set up a campfire and prepared a smorgasbord. When I sat down at the table, my belly completely empty, but the spread before me full with everything a man could ask for, I felt once again like all the turmoil I had been through was worth it. I dug into the food and ate to my heart's content in the pitch black night. The food had a sweeter taste than usual. It tasted like not giving up. After dinner, I enjoyed yet another well-deserved slumber. When I awoke, I finished my leftover victuals for breakfast, then did some light research on fishing, before heading back to bed for a mid-morning nap. For the last day, life was good. In the afternoon, I decided to bring Mildred along with me for my fishing excursion. At the lake up north, I caught a handful of small fish, and Mildred must have been able to calm down a bit because she laid me an egg. It was nice to have her by my side. She may not have been the keenest bird in the coop, but she did a good job of keeping the bitter loneliness away, even if it was just a little. I went back to town for some tent supplies. I found 2 tarps in the general store and another stuffed in the bathroom of the tool store. With the 3 rods I picked up, I had everything I needed for an improvised tent kit down the line. At one point, I dropped Mildred. Her cluck echoed like a gunshot. My heart stopped. I scooped her up, stroked her feathers, and whispered, "Sorry, girl." Back at base, I set her down in my room and went to sleep. But a nightmare jolted me awake. She wasn't there. I tore at the covers in a panic until... oh, there she was, just pecking at the corner. I laughed, but my hands shook as I pet her. Sleep wasn't coming back after that, so I disassembled furniture until morning. Carpentry by candlelight. By daybreak, I was back to the rhythm. Firewood, water, cooking, practice, and peace. I stopped looking like a ghost and almost felt human again. I had time to work on new skills and to organize my clutter. Meals stopped being survival and started being meals. In the morning, after 2 days of grazing and an honest, useful boredom, I'd finally exhausted the camp stores. My belly was the fullest it had been in weeks, warm, stupid with that simple comfort. And for a little while, I let myself believe a life could be cobbled out of small mercies. Mildred sat on my lap, a dull, feathered heat against my thigh, and we rolled deeper into the woods where the maps of the horde thinned and the road became a rumor. I siphoned a slug of fuel from a wrecked ambulance. The smell of petrol was like a promise. The neighborhood I passed through looked as if it had been emptied by a careless god, curtains still hanging, a child's shoe by a threshold, newspapers stuck to porches like wet leaves. Walking through it was like reading an obituary written in paint and dust. For a moment, I let my mind do the math. Small choices, cheap ingredients, the secret someone thought would save us all, and pictured the counter where I used to work. If a man flipping burgers could help break this, maybe a man flipping burgers could have prevented it. The thought felt soft and useless, and I tucked it away. Then there were deer on the interstate, 5 of them, stunned and beautiful. I eased to the trunk, retrieved the shotgun, and hunger sharpened everything. The idea of a roasted leg of venison made my mouth water. I stalked, slow as I could, heart a taut wire. Twice they twitched at my scent and slipped into the trees. I lost my patience and charged once, full clumsy speed, and met the world with my face in the gravel. No blood, only shame and a bruised ego. I scooped up Mildred, who clucked as if to mock me, and settled her back against my chest. Dinner could wait. We moved on. I came up on a clearing in the forest on the edge of an old crop field. Traversing through the field was stifling, so I foraged along the edge of it, looking for some morsels. I cursed myself for never learning the difference between edible and poisonous forage, having to discard every mushroom and berry I found. Just 24 hours removed from a massive meal, and the hunger was already starting to set in. How quickly the familiarity of it arose. The inventory of bait bugs and herbs in the trunk didn't make me confident enough to light a fire and cook tonight. I pitched a tent with an empty belly and slept in it for a few hours. At 8 p.m., I awoke and filled the pit in my gut with 2 raw acorns and a wild radish I had found earlier. After another few hours sleeping in the tent, I awoke to the violent billowing of my tent's exterior. It was a torrential downpour, so bad that I chose to seek shelter in the dry cabin of the truck. There was plenty of time to sit and think, but my thoughts weren't anything I wanted to be left alone with at this point. Every few minutes, the morbid consideration of devouring my companion passed through my mind, and I quickly shooed it away. I tucked her close to me and went back to sleep for another few hours. In the morning, the rain still hadn't let up. I packed up the soaking wet tent and decided to move on. I drove gingerly. I could barely make out what was only a few feet ahead in these conditions. The only time I could see the road clearly was in the instance when lightning cracked in the distance. I decided the weather was too debilitating to make any meaningful headway in. I would have stopped on the side of the road and waited out the storm if I weren't fortunate enough to find a deserted home to shack up in for a little while. I read a comic book in a room upstairs and watched the torrent fall, thankful that I wasn't out basking in it. I slept for a few hours in one of the beds while Mildred clucked in a corner. When I awoke, I poked around in the bedrooms upstairs but didn't find anything useful. I must have alerted a lurker outside because I heard banging on the back door downstairs. I went to investigate and was almost snuck up on by a lurker I missed in the house. I scooped up Mildred from the bedroom upstairs and ran out the door. The undead had assembled around the property and nearly gotten my truck with me. The storm made great cover for them. I couldn't stick around there any longer. I followed a narrow scenic road south for a few miles and ended up parking in a clearing. The rain had let up a bit, but it was still coming down way too hard to justify doing any foraging. Still, I was starving, and I needed to eat. Mildred's warm presence on my lap continued to scratch at me. My mind was bargaining. Just a leg. We don't have to eat all of her. I smacked myself and got out of the truck to start foraging. Not too far along, I found the most beautiful leek I have ever seen. Dinner. I headed back to the truck and first made sure Mildred was fed and watered. Lucky bird gets to live on a bag of animal feed I found and is too simple to know the difference. I set up a campfire in my tent, then prepared a modest leek stew. I also threw some acorns and the centipede I had found on the fire. Mildred kept wandering and I had to reel her in every so often to make sure she wouldn't get lost. With the rain still coming down, it would have been easy to lose sight of her. I nibbled on my acorns and some nettles I had found earlier, and my belly was starting to feel at least a little satisfied for the first time in 2 days. But then, as I was tending to my small fixings, Mildred wandered into the fire. The rain wasn't enough to put her out. She burned, feathers curling, clucks swallowed by the storm, until there was no bird left, just a pile of ash scattered in the mud. The smell hit me first. Burnt meat, wet feathers, a sour tang that clung to my tongue. I stood there for a long while, letting the rain plaster my hair to my face, dumbfounded that my only companion had chosen her own cremation. Not even in death did she feed me. I let the leek stew go cold in my hands, its steam fading into the downpour. I was soaked, starving, and colder than I had ever been, and above all, I was alone again. I sat at the fire, dejected and wet, with my back to Mildred's soaked remains. She was a good chicken. A great chicken. My chicken. And though I only got the pleasure of spending a couple of weeks with her, they were weeks that I'll never forget. Weeks I'll cherish for as long as I live in this hell that the world went and became. Despite all the blood that stained my hands, all the empty-bellied nights, the fire and flames I had to walk through, and the parades of undead I had to herd to keep her alive. She was a light in the darkness, the thing that gave me a reason to take care of myself when that had become something I couldn't care less about. There is no manual for burying a chicken in a world that has forgotten how to be gentle. I scraped a shallow pit and placed in it a single blackened feather I had rescued from the mud. I sat at the fire until the rain finally extinguished its last embers and the sun abandoned the night. I ate my cold leek stew and retired to the tent for what would surely be a restless night. I awoke at 2:30 a.m. and rekindled the fire. I wasn't able to get much more sleep. Hopelessness consumed me. I missed the warm spot I held to my chest every night. Now, The only warmth I enjoyed was that of the fire before me, the same one that took Mildred away. In the morning, I put out the fire, packed up the tent, and said one final goodbye to my loyal companion. The loud thunk of the trunk closing and the familiar sound of the truck engine waking up filled the consuming silence and signified the start to another journey, this time one without Mildred the chicken. Something was boiling inside of me, like the pressure of a kettle just before the whistle. The road stretched ahead, broken and slick with rain, but all I could feel was the weight behind me, the absence in the passenger seat where Mildred should have been. Every bump in the road rattled me harder than it should have. Every turn of the wheel reminded me I was alone, and in that silence, something started to grow, slow, steady, dangerous. I came up on a home in the middle of the woods. Something came over me, and my impatience made me blare the horn in the front driveway. I lured a few lurkers to me and relished in taking them down. I was almost disappointed there weren't more. I checked a chicken coop on the property, and poetically, there were no chickens there. In the barn, I entered the pig pen and turned one into dinner without a second thought. I lit the wood stove inside the house and gnawed on pork until my belly felt full, saving some chops for later. I slept in the truck and then left. There wasn't anything for me here. I drove back along the road to my old home. I didn't know why. When I came up to the infested gas station and diner I avoided a month or so back, I decided to park, leaving the truck running. First, I started swinging my machete, taking down any lurker who wanted a chunk of me. In the glow of my truck's headlights, the herd began to swell to an unmanageable size, and my senses began to take hold. What am I doing? I asked myself. I lured a handful of the horde to the nearby tree line, then doubled back and snuck over to a locked gun supply store and broke down the door to let myself in. I was tired at this point, too tired to fight. I hid out in the bathroom there to catch my breath and what little sense I had left. Why was I fighting? Did my will to live evaporate in the last 3 days? Where was the Hugh Jass that just wanted to cook and live peacefully? I had lost him at this point, and I didn't know if I'd ever get him back. Sitting there in the dark gun store bathroom, alone with my thoughts, tired and hungry, I concluded that if death was really what I wanted, I wouldn't let my final chapter be a meaningless one. I exited the bathroom at dawn and equipped myself with a Desert Eagle. I loaded it up and went back to the truck. There was a swarm loitering around the running engine. I knew it was probably starting to run low on fuel. I had to lure as many as I could away from it. I began firing, and that seemed to get most everything's attention in the area. I continued firing as I receded into the forest, and once I got far enough, I snuck my way around the backwoods behind some homes and crept onto a front drive outside of a home I could hopefully find some food and rest in. What am I doing? I asked myself. I dispatched the 2 lurkers waiting out front, then I found one inside and took care of him quietly. I went upstairs to make sure it was clear, then went back downstairs. Only one more left to handle, and I can finally go to sleep, I thought. Well, that one made me earn my rest, and I ended up with a fresh wound. Just a scratch, but any injury caused by a lurker could be a death sentence. I disinfected it and placed a sterilized bandage on the wound, hoping my final days weren't determined by that. Upstairs, I ate a couple of cans of food I had found in the cupboards, and finally went to sleep. I woke up a few hours later, not fully rested. The truck's fuel tank was likely empty at this point. I sat on the end of the bed, considering next steps. After an hour of finding no easy plan forward, I went back to sleep. I waited for a long while in that bedroom. No ideas popped up. I had driven myself into a corner. Once again, Hugh Jass, the notorious failure, had dug his own grave. All I could do was wait for dawn and try to return to the truck. I gently began a beeline for the truck under the cover of the thick morning fog. I was fortunate to attract the attention of only a small handful of lurkers as I approached the diner parking lot that the truck was in. I surgically dispatched them as quietly as I could, and I came up on a working Masterson with a full gas tank. I had the foresight to break into it, smashing the passenger window and hot wiring it, just in case I had to make a quick getaway. Then, I approached the truck, which was still running. There were about 10 lurkers still loitering around it. My diversion the prior day was enough to attract most of the others into the woods, and many of them were now hanging around adjacent to the gas station, about 100 feet away from the truck. The few that remained were quietly lured 1 or 2 at a time. I pushed them over and let my foot do the honors, making sure to stay as quiet as possible. My hands were shaking, and my heart was racing. Fortune was shining on me for once, and my mistake was being forgiven. I grabbed the extra gas I had in the trunk of the truck and filled the tank, then entered the driver's seat and sighed with immense relief as I put the diner in my rearview mirror. Hugh Jass, the miracle worker. As I drove along the road, I had time to think. The events of the past months rushed through my mind. Each day was a battle that, to this point, I had continued to emerge victorious from. And yet, the trophy was just a sense of empty pride. It was a sweet scent of triumph laden with the stench of what seemed to be inevitable failure. I got out of another hairy situation today, but how many more would I need to face? When would the chapter of my life come that I could finally enjoy some peace? Not just for a day or two, but forever after. And accompanying that sense of dread was this growing stitch in my heart of unaddressed rage, as if there was something I should have been doing, but I was avoiding it all this time, like I had been completing side quests while the main storyline was still waiting in front of me for me to step into it. And in that thought line, as I started once again down that familiar stretch of road, I knew what had to be done for me to truly feel free. I turned the corner into Rosewood, like I'd done hundreds of times before. I honked the horn to alert the horde of my presence, then I calmly parked a little ways past the Spiffos and equipped my Desert Eagle. I began firing rounds periodically, making sure to round up as many lurkers as I possibly could. I herded them up, hundreds of them. When I finally felt satisfied, my final round fired, I tossed a Molotov into the middle of them and set the herd ablaze. Something that was only a whisper a week ago was a roar now. I had called it grief. It had always been hunger. I drove the herd the way I used to drive a dinner rush. Hand steady, eyes hot, until the heat caught the sign, the booths, the smiling raccoon that once told me to serve and smile. Grease leapt like old sins. I walked through it, soaked in black blood and kitchen smoke, and I felt the lie peel off me in sheets. They made a recipe and called it food. I served it and called it work. But today, I gave it back its heat. The flames didn't care who was to blame, they only did what fire does. Strip, reveal, begin again. Mildred was gone, my neighbors were gone. The man in the chef's hat was gone too, and in his place stood something scorched clean. I wasn't brave, I wasn't noble, and I wasn't good. I was just a man who was finished. Finally, honestly finished, with pretending this place could be anything but ash. When the roof sagged, and the kitchen screamed like it remembered every meal we poisoned, I didn't pray, I breathed. I let the fire take the room where I used to season the beef, and I walked through the flaming undead like the inferno itself. And in that moment, whether it was acceptance or blind arrogance, I felt like if the story ended here, inside the kitchen that I had finally told the truth to, then it had been a good life. A life worth having lived. And though no one was left to miss me, I could rest easy knowing I had done what was right until the bittersweet